So thank you, Congressman Armstrong from Windows today, and I'd like to turn the floor over to you for your remarks.
Well, I just appreciate the opportunity to do this. And I mean, as we talk about what's going on, in energy and commerce, we're going to mark up on Thursday a package of 15 energy bills and continue to move forward. We obviously, I think, have some opportunities to do some of this, if nothing else, because of the political reality and the Senate map for Democrats. Now, whether our Republican-led bills, unfortunately, very few, if any, will be bipartisan. But I think what we really do is put everybody's favorite senator from West Virginia in the best negotiating posture possible to get significant, I used to say reasonable deadlines. Now I just say unreasonable but finite deadlines to particularly deal with anything that touches NEPA, all of those different issues. At the same time, I'm reasonably confident we're going to get a WOTUS CRA through both chambers, and whether that gets vetoed, which I don't know or not, but we have an opportunity to have a conversation about this stuff in a more meaningful way. And I mean, I've obviously been doing it out here since 2018. We're the geographic center of North America, and we produce a lot of things we don't consume there. We also tend to be very close to our neighbors to Canada. Cross-border permitting reform is a big issue. It's not a Keystone XL bill. I said this in the hearing. Only one company can build the Keystone XL. Republicans aren't going to build it. The government's not going to build it. But there are 4 or 5 other cross-border permitting projects that are on hold because when you have a 10-year project and 2 presidential elections in between it and a politicized permitting process, it's pretty hard to raise capital for those projects. And we want to continue to work forward on smart and reasonable energy reform. The other thing I push a lot, and I think is really important, particularly when you come from an ag and energy state. My hometown's Dickinson, North Dakota. 24 miles to the east is the Red Trail ethanol plant. There's a renewable diesel ADM marathon project in between Dickinson and South Hart, which creates biodiesel from Red River Valley soybeans. They're now going to have the crushing plant in Spiritwood, North Dakota, and Marathon's going to do that biodiesel in Dickinson. We also are 20 miles north of Brady 1 and Brady 2, which combined is the largest wind farm in the state. And we're all in the southern part of the oil patch and oil and natural gas. We grow all the cereal grains. We have a livestock industry. So when we talk about all of the above energy, and my Democratic colleagues and even my Republican colleagues want to deal with it, I say, I'll have you over to my house for dinner. We do all of the above within 20 miles. But all of the above has to be talking about baseload power and the realities that we face. And we've seen this all happen. We've seen it happen in Germany and Europe and all of those things right now. And in any normal place, that would be a big red stop sign to say, hey, stop, slow down. Don't let policy outpace technology. Unfortunately, I don't work in a normal, reasonable, sane place. I work in Washington. So we continue to try and make some mistakes that we know for an absolute fact are going to be those mistakes. And I think that's what I push a lot. Like 10 years from now, the world's going to burn more coal, whether we shut every coal plant down in North Dakota or not. 10 years north, the U.S. or the world's going to need more oil and natural gas, whether we shut every oil rig down in North Dakota or not. And in fact, we won't shut it all down in North Dakota. We'll be producing it. My concern is what happens in the meantime, because the last 2 things I want to see is more consolidation in the marketplace. When you come from a shale play and small, everybody from small guys to mid majors that exist in that space, when you have smaller communities and those types of things, the competition, the job market, it doesn't matter if it's ag, coal, energy. The reality is if you shut them down, you destroy these communities in the meantime, but eventually somebody's going to come back for that resource because it's a value resource the world needs. So I don't think that I've never been worried about the environmentalist plan succeeding because I don't think the laws of physics allow it to succeed. I worry about it failing and what it does to communities in my state in the meantime. Guys, I could rant on this for 2.5 hours in any way you want it to go. I would just assume, we have all these bills we're marking up. We're dealing with permitting. We're dealing with those different issues. I'm actually going to Guyana next week to talk about, old school Monroe Doctrine stuff. It's the Western Hemisphere. It's a large, huge untapped oil reserve. The question isn't whether we're going to be involved in it, or the question isn't whether it's going to get developed or not. The question is whether U.S. companies are going to be involved in it, or we're going to cede that area to the Chinese and the Iranians.
So that's a great point, Congressman, and it actually connects to the point of the cross-border permits, right? Like all this is built into our nation's national security. And you talk about consolidation of the market. And if United States companies don't get involved, if the US market doesn't play a major role, you are going to see other companies or other nation states take over. So you want to talk a little bit about the importance of national security when it comes to developing not just US, but North American and even South American energy resources?
Yeah, and I'll start back when oil was trading at negative $36 a barrel. And I have colleagues on my side of the aisle saying, hey, let's stop those Saudi tankers from coming into the US. And my response is, it's a little more complicated than that. That oil was bought on contract 2 years ago by US companies, because we make 98% diesel out of our sweet crude in North Dakota, but it doesn't do so well in a heavy crude refinery. And more importantly, what's Saudi Arabia's number one concern in the whole world? It's Iran. It always has been, it always will be. Well, Iran and Iran's relationship with Russia is a part of that dynamic. If we orphan Saudi Arabia as an ally, and they are an ally, they're not always a good friend, but they're an ally. How long do you think before China picks up the phone and calls them? Like, we have to have strategic conversations about what this looks like. But I just have to be honest, even when we try and do it, I think the Biden administration gets it wrong. We have two options right now in South America, and we just pulled a loan from Guyana, and we're working with Venezuela. And and both of those are American companies, right? Chevron, Exxon, Hess. They're engaged in that, but we tend to do, I just think they miss the point so many different times. But Canada's a perfect example. First of all, and I said this in the hearing, I'm like, is there some secret Cold War with Canada I need to know about on national security? I think unfortunately in Canada, one of the problems is it was called tar sands oil. Like, my dad's company, we used to do, it's harder to drill a well anywhere in Canada than it is even on federal land in the United States. Like, they take the environmental portion of their drilling really seriously, but it's the definition of something goes to the lowest common denominator. It sounds dirty. What's a geologic formation? I think like having these conversations in a meaningful way. But they're our closest neighbor, our closest ally. It's all of those different issues. And particularly for somebody who borders them on our entire northern border, it's incredibly frustrating that we still have, we're the only country in the world that needs a vaccine passport to get across the border. The amount of legal economic activity, even before you get into the oil and gas space, that we are frustrating to do these things at the same time where the illegal activity is picking up at a massive rate, not just on the southern border, but the northern border. But we have to be smarter about how we talk about energy security and energy dominance. And that goes for both sides of the aisle. I love shale plays. I come from a place that has a pretty good one. But our long-term oil security is really being frustrated now by the lack of permits being granted in the Gulf, because those are 12 to 15-year projects. We're not seeing the problems from that now, but we will see it again in 12 years. And at that point in time, we may be at a place in maturity with the Bakken where I don't think so, but there's a reasonable alternative that we'll start seeing decreased production at that point in time.
Yeah, this certitude, right? When it comes to investment, you've talked about capital investment on the top of this, and making sure that we can get some regulations through that make a lot of sense. I'd like to turn a little bit to wind, because we're seeing the same challenge when it comes to wind. And you mentioned wind in your comments at the beginning, whether it's offshore or onshore. Environmentalists are for it until they're not, right? So I feel like that frustration exists even in that sector.
But even the New York Times hit it. 2 weeks ago, they wrote an article. We have all these renewable energy projects. And they're talking primarily wind and solar. And the headline was, good luck plugging them in. Take the Northern Pass project on the East Coast. It's bringing hydropower from Montreal that Boston wants. The last time it got beat 65-35, it's on its fourth state. It got beat 65-35 at the ballot. But before that, you know who shut it down? Indigenous tribes in Southern Canada and the Sierra Club. Wind, solar, whatever, nothing's cleaner than hydro. But it turns out utilitarian infrastructure is always unpopular locally. And by the way, we taught them how to beat that. That was Dakota Access. That was Keystone XL. You stick a shovel in the ground and you kill an earthworm, and you're in 17 different environmental lawsuits that exist all across the spectrum. And you deal with those issues. I mean, we have to figure out a way to get. I think the biggest difference between Democrats and Republicans, at least in the House, is we just don't have favored nations on infrastructure projects. We want them all built. We want to figure out a way to get it put into place. We'll compete in the marketplace. LNG exports, but now we get manufacturing groups saying don't do exports. It'll raise the cost. I'm like, well, that's not how markets work. But that's a longer. We have to get infrastructure in the ground quicker, and I don't care what it's for. And that's how you solve the wind solar issue. I mean, you have to get it connected. And you have to have more connectivity, right? If you're dealing with weather-dependent power, you're going to have to move it different and farther places.
So I know we only have you for a couple more minutes. So there is one thing I want to talk about because it's a relatively novel idea, and it's growing in North Dakota, and that's the idea of carbon capture and sequestration. How do you see that playing out? How do you see a federal role in that? And do you see North Dakota being a hub for that?
Well, I do see North Dakota being a hub because we're one of 2 states that has primacy, which is really, really important, because if you have primacy over the EPA, you can, and North Dakota benefited from being one of the later states to find oil. So we could pick the law we like from Oklahoma. We could pick the law we like from Texas. We developed it. We're on the other side of this, right? We're the most mature shale play in the country. And so carbon capture is going to be a real big part of that. There's a bunch of different things. One I'll start with. Everybody's in favor of 45Q, unless you're using it for enhanced oil recovery. Then anybody who works in the administration runs out of the room with their hair on fire. We have some local issues, drain tiling, permitting, those types of issues. But I think really the one I would be the most concerned about is, and it would be probably from a certain sect of the conservative side on my side of the aisle, is we don't like subsidies. So 45Q or any of those types of issues, to which I always respond with, that's fine, but we're not playing at zero. And we're not getting rid of the PTC or the repower provision. And so if you're going to allow electrons, often cases, to be sold onto the grid cheaper than it costs to produce, you need baseload coal-fired electricity in North Dakota in February. And it's not an intellectual conversation about future climate change. It's about whether or not you freeze to death when it's 26 degrees below zero, and all of those things. And I think we have an opportunity to do that. One of the things I really push a lot, whether it's blended fuels. Nobody's against blended fuels. What we're against is taking traditional barrels out of the market and replacing them with blended fuels. Because it's been since 1976 that we bought a refinery on. I love our refinery in Dickinson, but it's a boutique refinery. We haven't brought on real capacity since 1976. We have a bill we're marking up on Thursday to deal with that. And also dealing with those issues, we just have to figure out a good and better way to do this. But carbon capture has to be a part of this solution. Otherwise, you're going to run into a regulatory regime where you just simply can't compete. I mean, and deal with and figure out and function a way to make those things work.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot. Before I let you go, Mr. Vice Chairman, is there anything you'd like to, any closing remarks or thoughts?
No, I just appreciate doing this. We're just trying to look at better ways to solve these problems and to work forward in something that somewhat resembles a place where North Dakota is a big reason why the United States is, if not the only country, one of the only countries that is both food and energy secure. And that is a tremendous advantage as we move on into the 21st century on the world stage with our strategic adversaries. And only in a place as crazy as DC would we try and take that strategic advantage and turn it into a negative disadvantage. And I tell that to all my ag groups too. I'm like, unless you know of a different feedstock other than natural gas to help fertilize your dirt, you're in the energy industry. If you're in the blended fuel industry, you're in the energy industry. If you have to fill your diesel combine, you're in the energy industry. And I think, at least in my area, 60 to 75% of all the inflationary pressures can go directly back to energy. So we have a real opportunity right now to convince, if not necessarily everybody in DC, their constituents, that this is the right approach.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you guys so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I'm glad you've all been to North Dakota.
So I'd like to turn to our panel now. And again, thank you, Congressman. And we're going to go, of course, ladies first here. And we heard the Congressman talking about permitting reform, regulatory reform. Patrice is a regulator, former regulator in Oklahoma. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you think members of Congress, regulators, both in the state and federal level, can do that?
Well, thanks for letting me answer this question. It's my favorite question. What I give a lot of speeches on is regulatory reform. I was so excited to have the congressman on because Oklahoma and Texas were actually the two commissions that North Dakota relied on to implement their rules once they hit the Bakken. So I was really excited to hear from him because I got to work with some of those North Dakota commissioners and hopefully implement common sense kind of regulations for a statewide regulation. What I see in the regulatory environment is if you just look at one, let's just take one act, let's just take NEPA, which is what the congressman talked a little bit about. If you look at the stats on that, for a private sector company, for a private sector group of companies, it's an average of 661 pages to file an environmental impact statement, which is crazy. That's more than a ream of paper that you buy at Office Depot or wherever you buy it, just for one. And that's not counting all the responses that are allowed to happen or all the other filings that happen. It takes an average of 4 years, as long as 6 years, to get that through. So if you're talking to private equity, which I do a lot because I am a banker and an attorney, I work in these private equity worlds. You don't get private equity folks to say, oh, 30 years out, we're going to be happy that that thing finally got through a regulatory process. So I think we have to look at the regulatory burdens. And I also see, I'm not going to pick on any particular state, but there are states that are more friendly, whose states regulation have friendlier attitudes towards an all of the above kind of policy, who are friendlier towards wind, who are friendlier towards solar, and friendlier, of course, to Oklahoma's, one of our largest industry, which is oil and gas. So there are states that have undue regulatory burdens that try to step in, that the federal government actually invites to step in and to stop things from happening. So when you get the pair of some particular states and federal legislation like NEPA, that combining, it makes it nearly impossible for these large infrastructure projects to go forward, for these large, for the large development to go forward. So I think we have to cut some of the red tape. I think we have to modernize NEPA. It's a half a century old, for goodness sakes. We've had a lot of technology advances since then, and we need to consider those. We need to put some of that new technology, understand how it relates to these old, outdated regulations, and we need to modernize them.
Thank you. Brigham, I'd like to go to you just for a minute as someone who was in charge of the pipeline safety administration here in the federal government, someone who managed a pipeline up in Alaska. We've seen a couple of rail incidents just recently. Could you talk to us about the safety of pipeline vis-a-vis rail and truck?
Yeah, that's a great question, Craig. Thanks for asking me. I think they all have a role to play. There are certain times you can't use a pipeline. There are certain places you might not want to have rail. And at PHMSA, we regulated both, all hazmat by air, land, rail, and sea. But the truth is pipelines have an edge. And last time I did the math, it turned out they were 99.99952% safe. That's a very enviable record. We spill more gasoline at gas station pumps than we do through pipelines each year. They're also highly efficient because they're a one-way transportation system. There's a reason why they've transported the lion's share of energy products for the greater part of this century. That's because they're safer, they're less expensive overall on a per mile barrel traveled, and they're out of sight, they're out of mind. They're a one-way transportation system. They're more efficient. Everything else requires whatever you're shipping it in, the container, to come back to the point of origin to start over. So I think that's why pipelines have an edge. And with nearly 2.4 million miles of pipelines in the country, they are our underground energy network, our energy highways. Unfortunately, sometimes we need new ones because they don't always match up with where we're currently producing resources today, hydrocarbons, and where they're needed. And it used to be that pipeline projects were not very controversial. But, as we've seen here since really starting with Keystone, there is a group of people who claim that they're all about transportation safety, but it really has to do with the keep it in the ground crowd that can't keep it in the ground. And so they attack the logistical and the supply chain network of these energy products.
And Brigham, I know you spent a lot of time in Europe talking to some of your colleagues and former colleagues. What can we learn from Europe, and what do you think they are learning from us when it comes to transporting energy?
Well, they kind of look at this and kind of scratch their heads because even though, they may have some different ideas, to them, pipelines are not controversial. They don't understand why we would have any trouble with pipelines in the country. They use them, literally all over Europe as well. They have trouble with connectivity because of the different countries, and they're working on that because they recognize that a well-integrated pipeline network lowers the overall cost for all consumers. And frankly, they wish they had more pipelines. And not probably delving into Spider's world, but recently they've told me we didn't think we needed to worry about energy security any longer. Boy, were we wrong.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually to General Marks. What are your thoughts? We've seen what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing how the nation state Russia exerted its authority over parts of Europe, especially Germany. From your perspective, could you give us some thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. And as laid out by the congressman, let me take a step back and kind of respond to one of his observations. You get down to Guyana and you realize that Guyana is going to be, with the oil find that there is offshore, it will be per capita the richest nation in the world when that's exploited. So just kind of put that in the middle of the conversation. You realize what you have right there next to Guyana. You've got Venezuela and you have Colombia, and you have a lack of U.S. influence in that part of the world, which is quite unbelievable. Yet you have no lack of interest from the Russians and the Chinese in that part of the world. So this is an area where the United States needs to be very, very active. And it kind of is baffling. And I've never really got my intellectual head around why the United States is not more aggressively engaged in trying to be an influencer in that part of the world. Clearly, our East-West orientation, I think, based on what's happening in Ukraine, has really caused us to realize we need to kind of orient. We can do both. We can do both. We can have an East-West orientation and North-South to include some of the advances and some of the challenges that we see in the South China Sea, and with our friends, our growing relationship with the Aussies and the Quad, if you will, the relationship between India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. I mean, that needs to increase very, very aggressively. But what we see in Ukraine right now is the vulnerability of the reliance on our NATO partners, that part of the world, on the LNG, the hydrocarbons, when you look at Russia, that are coming from Russia. And clearly Russia is a petro state as well as a food state. Thank goodness the grain has been able to continue to flow out of Ukraine, out of Russia. And there's a reason why Odessa has not been shut down, right? Both Russia and Ukraine realize that the world need that, and those two economies need that. So these two warring nations have this agreement that allows them to look the other way so they can both take advantage of the port of Odessa. It's not unusual in warfare to find those kind of marriages of convenience that are necessary along those, within those different elements of power: diplomacy, military, economics, and certainly influence by way of information. So what we're seeing is that in many cases, there is fungibility in these commodities. We thought the sanctions might be able to really alter Russia's activity. My view is that it really hasn't altered. There has been no incentive that Putin has been presented to cease his activities in Ukraine. And let's bear in mind, most of the world, the majority of the world, are not participating in these sanctions. India, China, and a number, the routine autocratic nations, they're saddling up next to China and taking their lead. What's baffling to me is the United States has a wonderful opportunity to increase its relationship with India, and we haven't done that effectively. The world's largest democracy, and we're not doing that effectively because they need to get their hydrocarbons from Russia. They're cutting some very sweet deals that allow them to do what is best in their national interest. So it's the mix of all of this energy policy that relies or that really drives our national security decision-making. It's absolutely inexorably linked.
So I thought the congressman brought up an interesting point, Spider, about the relationship between, well, the adversarial relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, we are, as Americans, linked to that, and we are very concerned with what's going on in the Middle East, and certainly where Iran's head is. Could you just take a few minutes to talk about Saudi Arabia and Iran and how that impacts the United States?
Well, first of all, the United States has had a near violent, non-existent relationship with Iran for almost 45 years, right? Going back to the revolution in 79. Near violent, non-existent. That is potentially a nuclearized state. You can look at the intelligence community assessments at what level the enrichment of uranium the Iranians have been able to achieve. There's been a recent finding, albeit a small amount, but they've been able to potentially enrich that up to 80%. 90% is required for militarization of that uranium. The breakout period is where they are and where they need to be nuclearized at the military level. That is the problem for the intelligence community, because what can you do if your assessment is here and that gap is getting smaller and smaller? What is the behavior? What are the intelligence indicators and what are the behaviors that you can now put in place to arrest that development? That has to be done. And so we don't have a trusting relationship with Iran. The mullahs are about to leave the scene, and guess what? Their sons are going to come in. So we run the risk of having almost a century of a near violent, non-existent relationship with a potentially nuclearized state, which is completely anathema, does not embrace any of our democratic ideals, and is a threat not only to its neighbors, but as a nuclear state could be a threat globally. So we have to have a counterbalance. The United States needs to be able to have a rich and a fulsome relationship with Saudi Arabia, which means in many cases, we have to look beyond some very difficult relationship issues between the United States and Saudi Arabia. We have to be able to swallow hard in order to maintain that counterbalance to Iran's development until we can figure out how we're going to deal with Iran. Because if we don't deal with Iran, the Saudis will, I guarantee you the Israelis will.
Thank you. And Brigham, I want to come to you, and then I'm going to close with Patrice. But Brigham, you just heard General Marsh kind of lay it out. What can we do in the United States to help facilitate increased energy production? And then Patrice, I want to come to you and talk specifically about renewables and how we can make sure that we're getting renewables to market and sited and sourced. So Brigham, what should we be doing here when it comes to developing our domestic market?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that whether you stand on the side of hydrocarbons or renewables, the answer is yes. The answer is and. The answer is we need a true all the above approach to energy. That energy mix is going to naturally change over time, but trying to pick winners or losers is like trying to tell a runner to stop running and then lob the baton down the entire length of the track to the next runner that's not even on the track yet. We can't have an energy transition until whatever is going to replace hydrocarbons is up and running at full speed. We're nowhere near there. And as you know, what we can do is we have given away a significant lever of foreign policy and a significant strength in this country that we had by reaching near energy independence. I think the Congressman mentioned that. We need to get that back. We need to stop blocking projects. We need to allow the market conditions to require hydrocarbons for now for baseload energy, add to nuclear, and allow renewables and other programs to develop as they naturally would. And I really think by 2050, we're going to be talking more like a hydrogen economy than we are a renewable economy.
Thanks, Brigham. And Patrice, my kids and I, we did Route 66 for our summer vacation last year. So we got to drive through part of Oklahoma and certainly can see the the renewable development there in Oklahoma. We know that Texas has more windmills than any place else in the United States. So, you know, when it comes to the Midwest, when it comes to the United States, what can we be doing to bring more renewables online?
Okay, Craig, Texas may have more turbines than Oklahoma, but it's only because it's a little bit bigger. I gotta tell you. So we have brought on considerable number of wind projects in Oklahoma. We also have hydropower. One of our largest providers of power is from Grand Lake up in the Tulsa region of Oklahoma. So we really do have an all of the above kind of attitude in Oklahoma. One of the things that I think we have to do is quit blocking these projects. And as a former mayor, I know that I've lived through NIMBY. I've lived through the not in my backyard in all sorts of projects, especially infrastructure projects. So I understand the concern that citizens have. But at this point in time, we're blocking the Dakota Access for, I don't know, the 6th time maybe, and having it go through another review. That's probably not right. 6 is probably not right, but we blocked it repeatedly. We're having now protesters blocking a wind project off the shore of New Jersey, which could really be very helpful to the Northeast. So I don't dispute that we need reviews for these projects and that we need regulations, but we need to cut the red tape. We need to get the regulations on the book so that there is a finite end. There needs to be a finite end so that people can invest in these projects, know when they're going to get a return on their investment, and we can get those things online. It doesn't happen overnight. And the thing that really was upsetting to me in the last year and a half, 2 years, was hearing them say, oh, well, we just need to, those big bag oil and gas companies aren't producing it fast enough or enough of it. Well, it's kind of hard to produce enough natural gas when you've blocked pipelines, when you've quit federal drilling, when you allow repeated reviews of pipelines that have been approved by the Corps of Engineers and every state entity. So we absolutely have to have a finite end to it. We have to, in order to have all of the above, which is what we need in the United States to be energy independent, we have to understand that infrastructure projects are going to happen, and they may happen closer to you than you like, but we need them. They're critical. As Brigham said, the pipelines are safe for the most part. And I think it's critical to our national security and to the life that we live in the United States.
Great. Thank you very much.
Greg, can I jump on
Absolutely.
what she just said? I think she really, really nailed it. Look, if we are not energy independent, we become unreliable partners globally.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We're going to be doing this, like I said, probably monthly, and we'll send notes out, but I really appreciate your time. And Brigham, thank you. Spider, thank you. And Patrice, thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.